In the mid-1700s, the American colonies did not look like the birthplace of a revolution. They were distant outposts of the British Empire. 13 colonies stretched along the Atlantic coast, loyal subjects of the Crown. Farmers worked their fields. Merchants traded in bustling ports. Children recited their lessons in small schoolhouses. Life was hard, yes, but it was steady. To most colonists, King George III was a distant figure. Respected, but not often thought of. The colonies were used to governing themselves in daily matters. But beneath this quiet surface, tensions were brewing. The British Empire had fought costly wars in Europe and in America, most recently the French and Indian War. To pay its debts, Parliament looked to the colonies. New taxes were levied: the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, duties on paper, paint, glass, and tea. To the men in London, it seemed logical. The empire had protected the colonies. Now the colonies should help pay the price. But to the colonists, it felt different. They were being taxed without a voice. They had no representatives in Parliament. They had no say in the laws that now reached across the ocean to shape their lives. And so a simple phrase was born. Whispered in taverns, printed in newspapers, spoken in meeting halls. No taxation without representation. It was more than a slogan. It was a cry of dignity. It was the voice of ordinary farmers, craftsmen, and merchants who felt their rights as Englishmen slipping away. In Boston, Samuel Adams roused his neighbors with fiery words. In Virginia, Patrick Henry stood in the House of Burgesses and thundered, "Give me liberty or give me death." These were not the polished words of philosophers alone. They were the raw voices of a people discovering that freedom, once questioned, could not be ignored. Yet rebellion did not come overnight. For many colonists, loyalty to Britain ran deep. They spoke the same language, read the same books, prayed in the same churches. The idea of breaking away from the mother country felt unthinkable. And so, the 1760s became a decade of division, neighbors debating, families divided at dinner tables. Was Britain protecting them, or exploiting them? Could they demand their rights while still remaining subjects of the king? The seeds of rebellion were not sown in secret societies alone. They were planted in ordinary hearts, in the shopkeeper who refused to buy British goods, in the farmer who felt the sting of unfair taxes, in the mother who told her children stories of freedom. When Parliament passed the Stamp Act in 1765, requiring an official stamp on every piece of paper, newspapers, contracts, even playing cards, the colonies erupted. Protests spread from Massachusetts to South Carolina. Effigies of tax collectors were hung in the streets. Mobs gathered. British officials were forced to resign. For the first time, the colonies acted together. They sent delegates to a Stamp Act Congress, drafting petitions, declaring their rights. London repealed the law, but the damage was done. A seed had been planted, the knowledge that resistance was possible. And though repeal brought temporary calm, the memory lingered. The colonists had tasted unity. They had discovered their own voice. In taverns, men spoke of rights. In churches, preachers thundered about justice. Pamphlets carried ideas across towns and villages. The air was alive with something new, something dangerous. Still, few spoke openly of independence. That idea was too radical, too extreme. What they wanted, or thought they wanted, was fairness, equality, a recognition that they too were citizens of an empire that claimed to value liberty. But once the question of freedom is raised, it cannot easily be silenced. And so, in the quiet fields of Virginia, in the crowded streets of Boston, in the echoing halls of colonial assemblies, the seeds of rebellion began to sprout. No one knew it yet. Not the farmers, not the merchants, not even the fiery young leaders. But history was moving. The soil of America was breaking open, and from it, a revolution was beginning to grow. The 1770s dawned with unease in the American colonies. The taxes had not stopped. The sense of injustice had not faded. Britain still saw its colonies as sources of revenue, subjects to be managed, voices to be ignored. But the people were changing. They had begun to realize that petitions alone could not move an empire. Words had power, yes, but sometimes words needed action. In 1770, tension exploded in the streets of Boston. A crowd gathered, angry at British soldiers stationed in their city. Snowballs and insults were thrown. Shots rang out. 5 colonists lay dead in the snow. The event became known as the Boston Massacre. To the Crown, it was an unfortunate clash. To the colonists, it was proof that Britain would spill their blood to keep them silent. Paul Revere engraved the scene, spreading the image like wildfire. For the first time, Americans saw themselves not just as subjects, but as victims of tyranny. Still, the Crown did not bend. Taxes on tea remained. Parliament gave the British East India Company the right to sell tea directly to the colonies, undercutting colonial merchants. It was not just about tea. It was about control, the power to dictate commerce, to enforce obedience. And so, on a cold December night in 1773, the spark was lit. Men of Boston, disguised as Mohawk Indians, crept aboard 3 ships docked at Griffin's Wharf. With silent determination, they pried open chest after chest of tea and dumped them into the harbor. The black water turned bitter with thousands of pounds of leaves. A fortune destroyed, an empire mocked. The Boston Tea Party was not just a protest. It was an act of open defiance. Ordinary men had stood up against the world's mightiest empire and said, "No more." The response from London was swift and merciless. Parliament passed what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. Boston's harbor was closed until the tea was paid for. The Massachusetts government was placed under direct royal control. Soldiers were quartered in private homes. The message was clear. Rebellion would be crushed. But Britain miscalculated. Instead of cowing the colonies, the Intolerable Acts united them. For the first time, leaders from across the colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. Farmers from Virginia, merchants from New York, lawyers from Massachusetts, men who had once thought of themselves only as Virginians, or New Yorkers or Bostonians, now began to think of themselves as something new, as Americans. In those meetings, voices rose with passion. Some called for reconciliation, others for bold resistance. But one thing was certain. The colonies would no longer bow silently. They agreed to boycott British goods. They pledged to support each other if attacked. This was more than politics. This was solidarity. And while the leaders debated, ordinary men and women prepared in their own ways. Local militias drilled in secret. Blacksmiths forged muskets. Mothers taught their children that freedom was worth sacrifice. The spark of resistance had become a flame. In taverns, whispers spread, "If they come for our rights, we must be ready." In pulpits, ministers thundered, "God made man free, and no king can chain what God has freed." In quiet homes, fathers sharpened blades and mothers sewed flags. The colonies were not yet at war, not yet. But the air was thick with inevitability. The people knew that the road ahead would be hard, perhaps deadly. And yet, there was no turning back. From Boston's harbor to the fields of Virginia, from crowded Philadelphia to remote frontier towns, the colonies were awakening. The spark had been struck, and soon it would ignite into fire. Every revolution begins not with muskets or cannons, but with ideas. Long before the battles, long before the Declaration, the American Revolution was fought on paper, in speeches, in the voices of visionaries who dared to say what others only whispered. In taverns and coffee houses, in meeting halls and marketplaces, words became weapons. And among the most powerful voices was that of Thomas Paine. Paine was not a wealthy landowner or a seasoned politician. He was an immigrant, newly arrived from England, a man of humble background and restless spirit. But in 1776, with the colonies on the brink of war, he published a pamphlet that would set fire to the American mind. Common Sense. It was written in plain language, not the lofty style of scholars. It spoke directly to farmers, shopkeepers, blacksmiths, ordinary people, and it asked a simple burning question: why should an island rule a continent? Paine argued that monarchy was a fraud, that kings were not chosen by God, but by ambition, greed, and bloodline. He painted independence not as a dream, but as a necessity. He declared that America had the chance to begin the world over again, to create a society built not on privilege, but on liberty. The effect was electric. Common Sense sold more than 100,000 copies in just a few months, in a population of barely 2 million. Its words spread like wildfire, carried by printers, merchants, soldiers. George Washington himself wrote that Paine's pamphlet worked a powerful change in the minds of men. But Paine was not alone. There was Benjamin Franklin, the elder statesman, printer, scientist, diplomat. Franklin's genius was not just in invention, but in persuasion. He had a gift for wit, for humor, for turning complex truths into phrases a farmer could remember. Franklin's writings reminded colonists that unity was survival. His famous cartoon of a snake cut into pieces with the words, "Join or die," carried more force than 1,000 speeches. Franklin was proof that knowledge and wisdom, shared freely, could bind a people together. Then there was Samuel Adams, the agitator of Boston. His fiery speeches stirred crowds into action. He organized committees of correspondence, early networks of communication across the colonies, ensuring that no act of British oppression went unanswered in silence. To Adams, resistance was not treason, it was duty. And in Virginia, another voice thundered. Patrick Henry, standing before the House of Burgesses, gave a speech that shook the walls of history. "Give me liberty, or give me death." His words were more than oratory. They were a challenge, a line in the sand. To live without freedom, he declared, was no life at all. These voices, Paine, Franklin, Adams, Henry, were not uniform. They argued. They disagreed. They came from different colonies and classes. But together, they created a chorus, a rising tide of conviction that liberty was worth the risk. And what made them truly powerful was not just their ability to speak, but their ability to speak for others. For the farmer plowing rocky soil, who had no seat in Parliament. For the mother raising children under the weight of taxes she did not choose. For the soldier drilling with a rusty musket, unsure if he could feed his family tomorrow. The visionaries gave them words. And once words are spoken, they cannot be unspoken. Once an idea of freedom takes root, it cannot be buried. By 1776, the colonies were no longer just resisting taxes. They were dreaming of independence. What had begun as anger over paper and tea had become something far greater, a vision of a new world, born in liberty. The voices of visionaries had planted this dream deep in the soil of America, and soon it would be tested by fire. By the spring of 1775, the colonies stood at a breaking point. Words had been spoken, petitions had been sent, boycotts had been organized. But London had not relented. Instead, the Crown sent more soldiers. Red-coated regiments marched through colonial towns, their bayonets gleaming, their presence a daily reminder of who ruled and who obeyed. In Massachusetts, the tension was especially sharp. Boston was under occupation, its harbor still closed from the intolerable acts. The countryside seethed with anger, and whispers spread that British forces planned to seize colonial gunpowder and arrest leaders like Samuel Adams and John Hancock. On the night of April 18, 1775, British troops began their march toward Concord. But they would not move in silence. Riders carried the alarm across the countryside. Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott thundered down dirt roads, shouting into the night, "The regulars are coming out!" Farmers and blacksmiths, shopkeepers and preachers, ordinary men, left their homes and gathered their muskets. They were not professional soldiers. They were militiamen, minutemen, ready to fight at a moment's notice. Their faces were weary but resolute. They knew they stood against the most powerful army in the world. And yet, they came. At dawn on April 19th, the British reached the small town of Lexington. On the green, a band of colonial militiamen, barely 70 strong, stood waiting. Their captain, John Parker, is said to have told them, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." The redcoats advanced. Orders shouted, muskets raised, and then no one knows who fired the first shot. But a crack split the morning air. The shot heard around the world. Chaos erupted. Smoke filled the air. The militia scattered, some cut down, others fleeing to reload and fire again. The British pressed on, reaching Concord, where more colonists awaited. At the Old North Bridge, the tide turned. Colonial militia stood firm, exchanged volleys, and forced the redcoats to retreat. What began as a march became a desperate withdrawal. From behind stone walls, from forest edges and farmhouse windows, colonists fired at the retreating soldiers. By the time the British staggered back to Boston, hundreds of casualties lay on the roads. The world had changed. For years, colonists had argued, debated, resisted. But now, blood had been spilled. This was no longer protest, it was war. In London, news of the battles spread quickly, shocking the empire. In Europe, whispers began. Perhaps this small rebellion could grow into something larger. In America, families wept for the dead, but their grief hardened into resolve. The revolution had begun. And what made it extraordinary was not just the courage of leaders, but of ordinary men and women who risked everything. The farmer who left his plow in the field. The mother who watched her sons march away with rusty muskets. The blacksmith who hammered out bullets by candlelight. They did not know if they would win. They only knew they could no longer bow. The shot at Lexington was more than a sound. It was a signal that freedom was worth fighting for. A signal that a people, once dismissed as weak and divided, had found their voice in fire and smoke. And that voice would only grow louder. By 1776, the colonies had already endured a year of war. Battles had been fought at Lexington and Concord, at Bunker Hill, across the hills of Massachusetts. Farmers had become soldiers. Villages had burned. Blood had been spilled. But even then, not all were ready to break away. Many still clung to hope that reconciliation with Britain was possible. After all, to declare independence was to commit treason, a crime punishable by death. And yet, the tide of thought was shifting. Thomas Paine's common sense had shaken the colonies with its bold clarity. The king had declared the colonies in open rebellion. British warships prowled the coasts. In the hearts of many, the last ties of loyalty were snapping. It was time to speak plainly. America must be free. So in June of 1776, the Continental Congress appointed a committee to draft a declaration. At its heart was a young Virginian named Thomas Jefferson. Barely 33 years old, tall, quiet, often lost in thought, Jefferson carried the task of giving words to a dream. In a small rented room in Philadelphia, he sat by candlelight, pen scratching across parchment. He drew upon centuries of philosophy, Locke, Montesquieu, but more than that, he drew upon the voices around him. The farmers demanding fairness, the soldiers dying for liberty, the preachers speaking of God-given rights. The words he wrote would echo across ages. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These were not just lofty ideas. They were a direct challenge to monarchy itself. They declared that rights did not come from kings, but from God and nature. And if a government violated those rights, the people had not just the right, but the duty to alter or abolish it. Jefferson's draft was presented to Congress. For days, delegates debated, argued, amended. Some feared the consequences. Some worried about language. But on July 2, 1776, Congress voted for independence. And on July 4th, they adopted Jefferson's words as the Declaration of Independence. Outside in the streets of Philadelphia, the Liberty Bell tolled. Crowds gathered as the Declaration was read aloud in public squares. Men cheered, women wept, children shouted. For the first time, they were not colonists, not subjects. They were Americans. But make no mistake, the document was more than celebration. It was a death warrant. Every man who signed it knew he risked the gallows. Benjamin Franklin is said to have remarked with his usual wit, "We must all hang together, or most assuredly, we shall all hang separately." 56 men signed. Merchants, planters, lawyers, farmers. Their names, once ordinary, became immortal. John Hancock wrote his boldly, so large that, as legend has it, the King of England could read it without his spectacles. Yet the declaration was not just for kings and parliaments. It was for the world. It was a message across oceans, across generations, that liberty was not the privilege of the few, but the right of all. In that sweltering hall in Philadelphia, a new nation was born, not yet secure, not yet victorious, but alive in spirit. The words carried by Jefferson's quill lit a fire that muskets alone could never ignite, a fire of conviction that freedom was worth sacrifice. And so the colonies, now united as the United States of America, stood before the world and declared, "We are free." By late 1777, the dream of independence had turned bitter. The war was not going well for the Americans. Philadelphia, the revolutionary capital, had fallen to the British. Washington's army, battered and weary, limped into Valley Forge to make camp for the winter. There, in the frozen hills of Pennsylvania, the revolution nearly froze with them. The conditions were brutal. Nearly 12,000 soldiers crowded into wooden huts hastily built from logs and mud. Food was scarce. Supplies were broken. Some men had no coats, no shoes, just rags tied around their feet, leaving bloody trails in the snow. Disease spread. Dysentery, typhus, pneumonia. More than 2,000 would never leave Valley Forge alive. And yet, despite the misery, something remarkable happened. The soldiers did not mutiny. They did not abandon the cause. They endured, because they believed in something larger than themselves. George Washington walked among them daily. He shared their suffering, speaking to the men, encouraging them, listening to their grievances. To many, he was more than a general. He was a father, a symbol of hope. One soldier wrote, "His Excellency is full of care, seeing us cold and hungry, yet he stands firm, and so we must too." It was not Washington's brilliance in battle that saved the Revolution that winter. It was his presence. His unshakable resolve gave the men strength when everything else had failed. But Valley Forge was not only a place of suffering. It was a place of transformation. Into this bleak camp came a Prussian officer named Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a veteran of European wars. Von Steuben was eccentric, fiery, and disciplined. He drilled the ragged Americans relentlessly, teaching them formations, tactics, the art of professional soldiering. He cursed in German, then in French, then made his aides translate into broken English. The men laughed at first, but they learned. Day by day, step by step, the Continental Army was forged into something new. By spring, they were no longer a mob of farmers with muskets. They were an army, trained, disciplined, united. And perhaps even more powerful was the spirit that emerged. Around campfires, men spoke of why they endured. Not for pay, which was meager or non-existent. Not for comfort, which was absent. They endured for freedom, for the hope that their children would live in a world without chains. Valley Forge became a crucible. The revolution was tested there not by bullets, but by hunger, cold, and despair. And it was there that America proved it could survive the darkest winter. When the army marched out in June 1778, leaner but stronger, the world had changed. The British still held cities. Battles still lay ahead. But Washington's army carried something greater than weapons. They carried resilience. The snow and blood of Valley Forge had written a truth that no empire could erase. A people who endure suffering for freedom cannot be defeated. Every revolution has its moment of despair, when defeat feels inevitable. But it also has its turning point. The moment when courage and chance combine to change the course of history. For the American Revolution, that moment came at Saratoga. In 1777, the British devised a plan to cut the colonies in two. General John Burgoyne led a large army south from Canada, intending to seize control of the Hudson River Valley. If successful, New England would be isolated, the rebellion strangled. Burgoyne's march was slow, burdened by heavy baggage and overconfidence. He brought not only cannons but wine, silverware, and even fine clothes, expecting victory to be quick and glorious. But the American wilderness proved less forgiving. The colonists knew the land. They cut down trees to block roads, harassed supply lines, and melted into forests after each skirmish. Native allies and militias struck at vulnerable points. Burgoyne's redcoats found themselves stalked by an enemy they could not pin down. By September, Burgoyne's army reached Saratoga, New York, where American forces under General Horatio Gates and the fiery Benedict Arnold awaited. The battles that followed were fierce, chaotic, and desperate. Arnold, reckless and brave, led charges that broke British lines. American riflemen targeted officers, sowing panic, and ordinary farmers turned soldiers stood their ground with a determination that stunned the enemy. At last, on October 17, 1777, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army, nearly 6,000 men. It was the first great American victory, a moment that proved the impossible might be possible. The world was watching. For months, American envoys, including Benjamin Franklin, had been in Paris, pleading with France for support. France, still bitter from its defeat to Britain in the 7 Years' War, hesitated. Could these ragtag colonists truly stand against the British Empire? Saratoga gave the answer. It showed the world that the Revolution was not a hopeless rebellion, but a fight that could be won. In 1778, France formally entered the war as an ally of the United States, bringing money, supplies, ships, and soldiers. Soon, Spain and the Dutch Republic joined as well. The struggle of 13 colonies had become a global conflict. Britain, once the hunter, now faced a world of enemies. But the turning tide was not just diplomatic. It was personal. For the soldiers who bled at Saratoga, for the families who buried their dead, victory brought a surge of hope. They saw that sacrifice was not in vain, that liberty was not just an idea, but a prize within reach. One soldier wrote home after the battle, "I believe now we are truly making a new world." And indeed, something new was rising, a sense of identity, of unity, of destiny. The colonists no longer saw themselves merely as resisting oppression. They saw themselves as builders of a nation. Still, the war was far from over. Dark years lay ahead, battles lost, betrayals endured, suffering continued. But from Saratoga onward, the revolution carried momentum. The dream of freedom had found not only its voice, but its strength. The tide had turned. And though storms would follow, the current now flowed toward liberty. By 1781, the American Revolution had raged for more than 6 years. There had been victories and defeats, triumphs and heartbreak. Washington's army had endured hunger, cold, and despair. The British still held New York and much of the South. Many wondered, could this fragile revolution truly succeed? The answer came in a small Virginia town called Yorktown. British General Charles Cornwallis had marched his army there, seeking to fortify a position on the coast. He believed the Royal Navy would protect him, that British sea power would always be his shield. But the tide of history had shifted. In the Chesapeake Bay, a French fleet under Admiral de Grasse clashed with the British Navy, and won. For the first time, Britain lost command of the sea. Cornwallis was trapped. On land, Washington saw his chance. He marched his Continental Army south, joined by French troops under the brilliant General Rochambeau. Together, they laid siege to Yorktown. The scene was unlike anything the Revolution had yet seen. American and French soldiers dug trenches side by side, their shovels striking earth in unison. Cannons thundered day and night, pounding British defenses. Musicians played to keep spirits alive, while prayers rose from chapels and campfires alike. Inside Yorktown, British soldiers endured hunger, sleeplessness, and fear. Their once proud redcoats were tattered, their supplies dwindling. Cornwallis waited desperately for reinforcements that would never come. On October 14th, American and French forces launched a daring nighttime assault on two key British redoubts. Leading the charge was a young officer, Alexander Hamilton. With bayonets fixed, the men stormed the defenses. Within minutes, the positions were captured, the British lines collapsing. The end was near. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered his entire army, more than 7,000 soldiers. The British marched out with drums playing a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." And indeed, the world had been turned upside down. A handful of colonies, dismissed as weak and divided, had defeated the greatest empire on earth. When news reached Philadelphia, bells rang, crowds cheered, tears flowed. Washington, normally reserved, allowed himself a moment of triumph. But even he knew this victory belonged not just to generals, but to the people, to the farmers who left their fields, the mothers who endured hunger, the soldiers who never came home. Across the Atlantic, shockwaves rippled through London. The British Parliament debated in grief and anger. The war had become too costly, the colonies too determined. Peace negotiations began. Though fighting would drag on in distant places for 2 more years, Yorktown marked the effective end of the Revolution. Independence was no longer a dream. It was reality. The world had witnessed something extraordinary. An idea made flesh. That ordinary people could rise against kings and armies and win. That freedom was not a gift bestowed by rulers, but a right seized by those brave enough to demand it. As one French officer wrote, standing in the silence after the surrender, "Here, liberty has won her victory." The Revolution was not just America's story. It was a signal to the world that the age of kings could be challenged, that the voice of the people could shape destiny. And from that small Virginia town, the echoes would spread. Across Europe, across centuries. Victory had been won, but peace brought its own battles. When the guns fell silent after Yorktown, when treaties were signed and Britain recognized American independence in 1783, the young nation faced a sobering reality. Winning freedom was one thing. Building a country was another. The war had left America exhausted. Farms were ruined, trade disrupted, families broken. The Continental Army, having fought without steady pay, disbanded in frustration. Many veterans returned home to poverty. Merchants and farmers faced crushing debts. The new government, under the Articles of Confederation, was weak, unable even to collect taxes effectively. The dream of liberty was alive, but the machinery of governance faltered. 13 states, each fiercely protective of its own power, struggled to act as one. There was no strong central authority, no president, no Supreme Court, only a fragile Congress that could pass resolutions but lacked the strength to enforce them. And yet, in this chaos lay opportunity. For the first time in history, a people stood free to decide how they would govern themselves, not by kings, not by lords, but by their own consent. But freedom without order can collapse into anarchy. That truth became clear in 1786, when Shays' Rebellion erupted in Massachusetts. Angry farmers, burdened by debt and unfair taxes, took up arms against the state. They closed courts, threatened officials, and demanded relief. To some, it was the revolution repeating itself. To others, it was a warning. Liberty without stability could destroy the very nation they had fought to create. Leaders like George Washington, retired at Mount Vernon, watched with concern. Was this what they had bled for? A fragile confederation, unable to protect its people or secure justice? Washington wrote to friends, fearing that without change the revolution would be lost. Not to Britain, but to failure from within. The answer came in 1787, when delegates from every state gathered in Philadelphia. The Constitutional Convention was born. In that hot summer, men like Washington, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and Benjamin Franklin debated fiercely. Should power rest with the states, or with a stronger central government? How could they prevent tyranny while avoiding chaos? How could large states and small states share power fairly? Day after day, arguments flared. Compromises were forged. The Virginia Plan, the New Jersey Plan, the Great Compromise. The debates were not abstract. They were urgent, passionate, shaped by the memory of monarchy and the fear of failure. At last, a vision emerged, a constitution that created a system of checks and balances, dividing power between branches, balancing authority between states and federal government. A president would lead, but not as a king. A Congress would legislate, but be answerable to the people. A judiciary would interpret the law, guarding liberty against abuse. It was not perfect. It left contradictions unresolved, slavery foremost among them. But it was a framework strong enough to endure, flexible enough to grow. On September 17, 1787, the Constitution was signed. Franklin, frail and aged, looked upon the chair of George Washington, carved with the image of a rising sun. He declared with relief, "Now I have the happiness to know it is a rising and not a setting sun." The Constitution still had to be ratified, still had to win the hearts of the people. Papers were written, speeches given, fears addressed. But slowly, state by state, the people embraced the vision. By 1789, the United States of America was no longer just a dream of liberty. It was a functioning republic. George Washington was elected its first president. The voices that had demanded freedom now shaped laws, built institutions, and carried the weight of governance. The revolution had not ended at Yorktown. It had only shifted, from battlefield to assembly hall, from muskets to quills, from soldiers to statesmen. And in that shift lay the true test of freedom, not just the courage to win it, but the wisdom to sustain it. The American Revolution did not end in 1783. Its battles concluded, its treaties signed, but its spirit, its voices, have never been silenced. They echo still, not just in history books or marble monuments, but in the choices of every generation that followed. The Revolution was never only about muskets and cannons. It was about an idea, that ordinary people have the right to govern themselves, that liberty belongs not to kings but to all. It was about farmers who picked up arms, mothers who endured hunger, thinkers who wrote words that stirred the soul. It was about voices, loud and quiet, famous and forgotten, that together created freedom. When Jefferson wrote of equality, when Franklin urged unity, when Washington stood firm at Valley Forge, they were not only speaking for their time, they were speaking for all time. Their words became seeds, planted deep in the soil of America, seeds that continue to grow. Through the centuries, those seeds have been tested. Civil war, civil rights, economic struggle, wars abroad and divisions at home. Each challenge forced Americans to ask again, what does freedom mean? Who does it belong to? And are we willing to fight, to sacrifice, to endure for it? The Revolution's voices answer us still. Patrick Henry's cry, "Give me liberty or give me death." Jefferson's declaration, "All men are created equal." Paine's vision, "We have it in our power to begin the world over again." Washington's resolve, shown not in victory alone, but in patience, endurance, and humility. They remind us that freedom is not a gift secured once and for all. It is a responsibility, a fire that must be guarded, fed, and passed on. And perhaps the greatest lesson is this. The Revolution was not made by perfect men. They were flawed, divided, often uncertain. They argued, they failed, they feared. But they acted, they stood. They chose courage over silence, action over surrender. That is why their voices still matter. Not because they created a flawless nation, but because they dared to begin. They dared to imagine a future no one had seen before. Today, as we walk through the streets of Boston, or stand at the fields of Lexington, or gaze upon the faded ink of the Declaration in Washington, D.C., we do not only see the past. We hear it. The murmur of farmers, the thunder of speeches, the cry of muskets, the tolling of the Liberty Bell. They are still speaking, and they are speaking to us, to remind us that liberty requires vigilance, that democracy demands participation, that every generation must decide anew whether it will rise to the challenge of freedom or let it fade. The American Revolution was not just an event, it was a voice that said to kings and empires, "We will not be silent. We will not be ruled without our consent. We will be free." That voice still echoes, and it asks each of us, what will you do with your freedom?